Hi everyone and welcome. I am joined today by Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University and an advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Glenn. Of course, I was a media advisor once upon a time.
And well, there's been some interesting developments now. Uh, Again, there's often a lot of focus on Iran's nuclear program. Indeed, this is pretty much yeah, front and center when Iran is discussed, at least in the Western media. However, unlike Iran, who's a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Israel is not. And as we also know, it also has nuclear weapons, which is interesting because recently in the news we're told that Iran had acquired a lot of, I think, thousands of documents on Israel's scientific, military, as well as nuclear program. What do we know yet, or so far, about the content of these documents? And why does it matter, I guess?
Well, the government and the intelligence agencies, and I think the Ministry of Intelligence in particular, they are not saying much. They don't want to give up any information about how they brought the documents into the country. They don't want the Americans and Western intelligence agencies, which are in close cooperation with the Israelis, to figure out Iran's means and methods um, of, um, of of working in the intelligence realm. But what is clear is that there are a large number of documents that have been obtained, and they have to do with the nuclear program as well as other key issues that are important to the Israeli regime and how the regime functions and what sort of assets it has and how it interacts with its Western allies.
And sorry, another thing happened recently, which is the which well, I argue so changed the world. That is this attack on Russia's nuclear forces. This is yeah, quite extraordinary because, well, I would like to have your opinion on this, but it doesn't seem that this could possibly have happened without the support and knowledge of Western intelligence agencies. So the reason I say the world won't be the same is we've actually then taken the step of actively targeting Russia's nuclear forces. How, given that, well, again, a lot of the negotiations on Iran is also about, transparency. How will this affect Iran's decisions? Because part of the reasons why the Russians made themselves vulnerable was exactly because of the transparency. They park their bombers out in the open, so everyone will know where they are. And but how will this affect Iran? Will it also have some limits now on on the extent of its transparency, or how do you interpret these events?
Iran has a lot of experience with Western intelligence agencies and the Israeli intelligence agencies for obvious reasons. You had, especially during the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq and US and NATO activities in Syria, through Turkey and through Jordan, in Lebanon as well, the Caucasus, Azerbaijan in particular, and Central Asia. So the Iranians know how close the cooperation is between these agencies. Whenever the Israelis assassinate an Iranian scientist, uh, it is with cooperation. It is carried out through cooperation with Western agencies, Western embassies, and uh, agencies of certain countries in our neighborhood. Even with regard to the International Atomic Energy Agency, uh, it's clear that this so-called international body is dominated by the West, and that it is highly influenced by the Israeli Mossad as well as Western intelligence agencies. And whenever the relationship uh, between Iran and the United States and the West, for whatever reason, uh, calms down, we see the IAEA treat Iran more reasonably. Whenever the tensions from Washington increase, we see that the agency starts rehashing old accusations, raising new questions. So it is all everything is very political. What happened in Russia, in the eyes of Iranian officials, could not have happened without Western intelligence agencies being involved. And the Ukrainians simply don't have that capability. Just like when the Israelis want to carry out attacks in Iran, they have full support. The Ukrainians definitely had full support, and even more so than the Israelis because Ukraine is weak, it's vulnerable, and their agencies were rebuilt by both military intelligence and also other intelligence agencies were all rebuilt by the West. So for an operation to have been prepared for 18 months and the Americans not to know about it, that would have been, and the Israelis or the British, those agencies that work very closely with each other. For the Iranians, that's impossible for them not to have known about it. And the very fact that they struck these Russian planes and violated long-standing agreements between the Russians and the Americans over the prevention, in order to prevent nuclear war, shows that the United States, the West, does not respect its own uh, agreements. They use a third party to undermine those agreements. And that is a pattern that fits within a broader pattern. That's what we saw in Gaza, for example. Witkoff imposed a ceasefire, then the Americans themselves undermined it. Trump said Palestinians must leave. Uh, the United States, under Trump, violates its own agreements. It shifts its position, as we saw with Iran. One day, Witkoff was speaking about nuclear enrichment being okay with Americans. Then he shifts and takes a 180 degrees different position, or as the former German foreign minister would say, 360 degrees shift, which basically says, I think, says a lot about the West works. But anyway, change in the West is usually 360 degrees when we look at the real substance. I think this just reinforces the belief in Tehran that you cannot trust the United States, that you cannot negotiate with the United States in good faith because they'll undermine their own agreements in one way or another. And that's something that we also saw with the JCPOA. The United States, not only would it not the nuclear deal in 2015, not only would the United States abide by its commitments, but it would violate them and try to violate them. Uh, for example, they'd impose new sanctions on Iran uh, on terrorism or on human rights or something. They'd make something up so that they could expand the sanctions regime without actually doing it in the name of nuclear energy.
How can this dilemma be overcome, though? Because well, it is a key problem. If there will be a deal between Iran and the United States, it has to, which is organized around the level of enrichment. It would have to be based on yeah, some kind of inspections. But as you said, with all arms control and nuclear deal, you will always have this focus on transparency, which is the transparency again is good for building the trust, but on the other hand, it also makes the country very vulnerable to attacks, as you saw now with the Russians. That if you tell the opponent where your nuclear forces are, then they can be attacked. So given now trust is more or less yeah, completely absent, how could this be overcome? Is there I mean, it would be possible if inspections were, if there was a deal for invasive inspections that they were done by countries like Russia or China who do not want to see Iran with nuclear weapons, but they're not part of this anti-Iranian campaign either, who do want to weaken Iran. So it would that be a solution, or is there other ways to overcome this? Because my one of my thoughts when I saw the attacks on the Russian nuclear forces was, well, how are you going to make a deal with the Iranians now? With every name of a nuclear scientist, every location, any information that can be used to target Iran would eventually end up with the intelligence services. So how can we, I guess, adjust to this new world after the attacks on Russia's nuclear forces?
I'm not sure if there is a solution, Glenn. I don't think that the United States and the Europeans ever seek solutions. They always seek to weaken the side that they're dealing with and then to undermine or to undermine those agreements uh, and to cheat the other side simultaneously. So, with regards to the IAEA, which I alluded to earlier, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Iranians on numerous occasions, the Iranians and this body negotiated, and there were inspections, and they resolved issues. But then later on, when the United States found another reason, or for whatever reason they wanted to intensify hostility towards Iran, this body, this international body, would rehash those uh, uh, accusations. They would revive those accusations, even though they were resolved before. They would suddenly be revived, and that is because the International Atomic Energy Agency is deeply politicized, like all other international institutions created after the Second World War. They're dominated by the West. They are literally based in the West, so they have huge influence over people inside who work there. They have access to information uh, that exists in these bodies. They have a lot of control. So it is basically being used as a tool against Iran. So what they want is for Iran to constantly be uh, on the defensive. They do not want any issue to be resolved. All the files that are closed can be reopened, even that when this international body says everything has been resolved, the Iranians gave adequate answers, we no longer have any questions, we can move on now. That doesn't mean they won't be revived, and that makes dealing with the United States and the West literally impossible. And the issue really is not Iran's nuclear program. The Americans and the Europeans know that the Iranians were never developing a nuclear weapon. And indeed, if Iran wanted to develop a nuclear weapon, it would have done so a long time ago. The issue is weakening Iran, whether it's through accusations on nuclear weapons or terrorism or human rights or, if possible, global warming. Whatever they could use, they will use against Iran. And we see the same pattern with Russia. We see the same pattern with China. We see the same pattern with any country in the global south that may pursue policies that are independent of Western domination.
Yeah, what do you say about this international institutions being coopted? It is, we do have similar examples in Europe. Again, we have this, the inclusive institution, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And given that it includes Russia, it's supposed to be, you know, neutral and not partake in any of the bloc politics which we provide. But A funny case was back in 2003. Then you had the chairman of the OSCE, Jaap de Hoop Scheffer, yeah, Dutch man, and he proposed then that in Moldova we should outsource, the Russian peacekeepers should get away out of Pridnestrovia and they should be replaced by OSCE because it's an inclusive institution, something that could be trusted by all. However, the OSCE would outsource the peacekeeping to the European Union. And anyways, after he stepped down, he took over as the Secretary General of NATO. So one gets the impression that these institutions aren't as yeah, that they are, it's the same people wearing different hats. So there's some reason to have some distrust. But what is interesting though with this American demands now on that Iran has to abandon its nuclear civilian nuclear program as well is the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is the main treaty governing the rules on yeah, proliferation, but it's very specific. Countries who sign up, they cannot acquire nuclear weapons, but they have full rights for developing civilian nuclear power. Iran is a signatory to this, and so now it's not Iran that's breaching the Non-Proliferation Treaty, given that no one has any evidence that it's pursuing a nuclear weapons program. But indeed, it's being breached by the United States by pushing for, well, demanding that Iran is not allowed to even have a civilian program. This is how is international law and treaties gonna matter at all after this? There has to be some principles at place, though, doesn't it?
They don't really matter. That's the whole problem. Uh, the and this is one of the ironies is that of this the situation that we live in today, and that is that the rules-based order that the West created is being undermined by the West itself today. And in my opinion, it always served their interests because all of the institutions, as I said earlier, or post-war World War created institutions were biased towards the West. Uh, the WTO is biased. Everything that has been created over the last 80 years, all the international bodies, are more or less bodies that have a huge amount of Western influence. But even that is not tolerated today, which in a sense is not a bad thing because it creates an incentive for non-Western countries to create new bodies. For example, BRICS ultimately may be able to start creating bodies, parallel bodies in the cultural realm, in the uh, that go beyond just economics, higher education, student exchanges. Many of the bodies that international bodies that have in the past been controlled by the West are becoming increasingly irrelevant because countries are seeing how they're politicized and now they can really do something about it. I think this second aspect is the most important point of all. Now they can do something about it. The World Bank uh, or the IMF, they now have we now see rival institutions being developed. So by overusing sanctions, by politicizing these institutions far too often, the West has created an incentive for countries to find alternatives, whether it's deals with trade or anything else. And the I think that across uh, among Iran's allies, they recognize that the International Atomic Energy Agency is politicized. 10, 15 years ago, I think, or even 5 years ago, I think they didn't see it as clearly as they do today. But now it's becoming clear because they're all now. In the past, Iran was the main victim of the politicization of financial institutions, of the weaponization of the dollar, of the politicization of international bodies. But now you see many countries, including Russia and China as very important powers, uh, becoming themselves targeted by the West using these different institutions. And let me just give you one example of how the West, what sort of standards the West deploys. I was in Venezuela last week, and the country is under severe sanctions, and Cuba, which is next door, it is suffering under horrific sanctions. And while Cuba is being crushed by the Europeans and the Americans and the Canadians, we see that Syria under ISIS and Al Qaeda has had all of their sanctions removed. And the deputy head of ISIS, the former deputy head of ISIS, and the current head of the Al Qaeda in Syria is going to go to the UN General Assembly to give a speech. So while Cuba is being crushed, ISIS and Al Qaeda are being welcomed by the West. These are the sort of standards that we have to live with. But since the world is changing and since the balance of power is rapidly shifting from the West, I think that the ability of the West to use these tools is rapidly, the impact of them is rapidly decreasing.
This this reflects the political realist idea of international institutions, though, that they're a mere reflection of power. That is, they're not independent of their own, but yeah, reflecting the international distribution of power. And I guess part of the problem after the Cold War is when all power, at least in the 90s, were concentrated in the West. States don't constrain themselves, so these international institutions they instead impose constraints and limitations on others, but not where the power would reside. So this would corrupt and well destroy a lot of these institutions because they wouldn't actually live up to the goal or the mandate that they were given. Um, yeah, my last question though is about yeah, as you said, a lot of the nuclear program is about weakening Iran, and well, it shouldn't be controversial to say that this is primarily at behest of the Israelis, which see Iran as its main rival. But what is the state of Israel now militarily? Because they do appear to be overstretched. That is, the IDF is struggling in Gaza. Uh, the occupation of Syria has maybe overextended itself a bit as well, putting them in possible conflict with the Turks. We see, yeah, obviously problems in Lebanon, but also Yemen now, which is able to strike Israel. And this is all before an actual conflict with Iran has started. So, what is hopefully won't be started, but how would this work? To what extent do you see Israel as being overstretched at the moment?
Israel is severely weakened. Israel has never been a powerful entity. This is a myth that is always repeated in the Western media. Israel, the regime is completely dependent on the West for everything that it does. All the bombing campaigns carried out in Gaza, slaughtering families day and night, these are U.S. bombs. These are Western um, weapons that are provided to them, and they receive aid, both direct aid and indirect aid, which is much greater. And they have political cover, and the Western media, of course, gives them, uh, they attempt to give them cover as well, even though that's becoming increasingly problematic because people see right through the propaganda. And when the Israelis carried out attacks in the past against Iran, as I said earlier, all of them were carried out with cooperation of either neighboring countries or Western intelligence agencies based in neighboring countries, and possibly Western embassies in Iran in some way or form. But I think it's become pretty clear that when the regime carried out an airstrike against Iran, the Americans did the heavy lifting. And of course, there are air bases in the region, in Turkey, in Qatar, and the Emirates. They're all their military bases, their radar stations, um, and in Iraq. They were all used to assist uh, the Israeli regime, and the refueling was done basically by the jets were done by the Americans. despite that, their strikes were relatively unsuccessful. And the Israelis had to fire missiles from 100 kilometers uh, away from Iran's borders. And those missiles have small warheads, and their ability to create damage is limited. And also, they discovered that the Iranian radar systems were very powerful. Now, at that time, the West tried to pretend, and the Israelis tried to pretend that they destroyed Iran's air defense systems. But of course, we all know that if that was the case, the Israelis would have carried out wave after wave after wave of airstrikes against Iran, and they would have finished the job. So the Israelis themselves don't have the ability to wage any war against Iran. If they gave Iran an excuse, the Irans could hit them much harder. And right, the Iranians over the last 6 months, they've been preparing themselves for a broader war. They have been putting a lot of money into air defenses, but also in their missile and drone program, and especially on precision strikes. So the Iranians are preparing themselves for some sort of involvement of the United States. I think that is a part of their calculation. That is, of course, a deterrence as well to prepare themselves. But if there's any attack by the Israeli regime, it will have to be done with full American support and regional support indirectly, even though Qatar and Turkey may not be involved themselves, but they allow the Americans to use their bases against Iran and other countries too. So the Israelis can't do anything on their own, but the Iranians would hit them back very hard. If, on the other hand, the Americans get involved, then that's a different situation altogether. The Iranians, it will be difficult for the Americans because I think that these Arab family regimes in the Persian Gulf, they probably will push hard for the Americans not to use their bases because if they're used, that would be direct. They would be a part of the aggression, and I think that would mean the end of these regimes. So I think probably if the Americans want to strike, they'd have to fly over the Mediterranean, from the Mediterranean, or from Diego Garcia, which would make them very vulnerable, those aircraft. And if they want to have an impact on, let's say, a heavy bombing, then they'd have to fly over their target, and that means they'd have to go deep inside Iran. And I think that puts them in huge risk. Remember, Ansarullah in Yemen, or what the West likes to call the Houthis. Ansarullah, according to the New York Times, they almost downed an F-35 or F-35s. And that shows that all U.S. aircraft, even their so-called stealth aircraft, are very vulnerable. And obviously, Iran has much greater capabilities than what Ansarullah has. And Iran's response would be infinitely more destructive. So I don't see a situation where or the American, uh, the Israeli regime or the American armed forces would be able to strike Iran and not be defeated ultimately.
Actually, I have one last final question. Actually, I was curious because you follow the Western media a lot. Indeed, you're a very prolific commentator, and even Piers Morgan likes to have a quarrel with you every now and then, it seems. But as you follow the Western media, what is your impression in terms of what the West do not understand about Iran? What are the key wrong assumptions? Why do we keep getting Iran wrong all the time? And again, this is something that can be seen as being very harmful to the West as well, because if we're not assessing Iran properly, in other words, if we have stupid analysis, we're going to end up with very stupid policies. So, what is it that we do not understand about Iran?
You've been to Iran, and so have many other friends. A lot Western journalists from mainstream Western media also travel to Iran. And in private conversations, they say one thing, but in their documentaries or their reports, they're very different from what these people say in private. So they basically repeat these narratives. And the reason is that is because of money. That is because of these media corporations are not independent organizations that are out there to spread the truth. They are closely affiliated to power. Many of the so-called Iran experts or so-called Middle East experts, I don't like the term Middle East, but anyway, they too, in order to be able to receive funding, in order to work in these powerful think tanks or influential think tanks, they have to speak within a particular framework. They have to abide by certain narratives. So the experts, the media, uh, all of them are working within a particular narrative. And if they are confronted with truth, they will still repeat the same narratives, maybe with some subtle changes, but it will still be the same thing. And I think that's the problem with the West. They cannot move beyond the certain narratives that they've created because they feel that they are in their interests. And it also makes them feel better. Their sense of moral superiority, even though they're carrying out a Holocaust, their sense uh, of, uh, of superiority in all respects, it's strengthened by these narratives, the otherization of countries like Iran and others. And of course, it also helps miscalculation because while Iran is portrayed as inferior, as evil, and so on, it is also portrayed as backward, incompetent, uh, as a regime, which means it's unstable and not really legitimate, and therefore it's not going to last. So the way in which they frame these ultimately make their policies towards Iran deeply flawed and dangerous because they say, well, all we have to do is push harder and the regime, as they say, will fall. And of course, even though we're supporting genocide and Holocaust and we're destroying country after country, we're still the good guys and they're the bad guys because they are, because of those narratives, inferior to us. So it gives them a sense of it, it it sort of makes them feel vindicated that even though they're when they destroy Iraq, it's not a crime, it's a mistake, and the policy was a mistake. When they destroyed Libya, it was a mistaken policy. When they use ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria, it's because Assad is the bad guy, even though the tools that they use are the worst possible tools on this planet, but they still justify it through these narratives. So I don't believe that there's any hope in Western institutions, Western media, and that's why I don't think that any of these problems are going to be resolved unless there is a sea change, unless something happens, unless the West faces a major catastrophe, economic or military catastrophe, which I think is inevitable in either economic, political, or military, or maybe a combination of these things. I think we're nearing that point, and I think it's not very far off. Now, what happens after that, I don't know, but it is possible that the Western powers would be forced to reassess their role in the world, and it's possible that they may do something extremely stupid that could risk life on this planet.
Yeah, I agree. We seem to be moving towards some kind of an end game because this is not sustainable anymore. But it's interesting, yeah, the weakness of the Iranian regime because we say this also about the Chinese and the Russians that the assumption that they're standing kind of on one leg, if they're pushed hard enough, they will fall over. Yeah, this underlying premise. It is interesting because in Europe, the Russian president is the most popular leader of no other leaders polling 80-85%. The Chinese as well, they've had, the governments has a lot of legitimacy, but you can't break with the narrative. I think this is a key mistake I made as I live here in the West. The assumption that if I would just come with the argument, substantiate the argument properly, that it was just necessary for people to understand the counter argument. But as you said, there's a dominant narrative, which is kind of the official truth. And if you don't follow it, there's no counter argument. They don't question your evidence. They say, well, then you're pro-Iranian, you're pro-Russian, you're pro-Chinese. And then, yeah, this is to delegitimize and try to destroy you. So if you want to preserve your credibility and legitimacy as a scholar, at least in the West, you do have to follow these narratives. So it is, yeah, it's our own curse, I think, because as I said before, we end up with stupid analysis resulting in stupid policies, and yeah, here we are at the end of the line, I think. So, anyways, Professor Marandi, I always love talking to you, so thank you again for taking time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure, and I believe that your great work still has a important impact, and the world is changing. And so, I think the hold that these institutions and these centers of power have on public opinion in the West and across the world is declining. So we have to push harder, be show people the flaw in their logic or the flaws in their logic and the inhumanity of their policies. And I think increasingly people will wake up, and hopefully we will see a better future for everyone.
Thanks.